Good afternoon, and welcome to The Road to Recovery, The Road to Freedom with Mark. This is my Friday afternoon slot. Friday is rolled around again, and Christmas is coming up on us mighty fast, and won't be here for the 27th, but I just want to wish everyone a good Christmas and make sure that the most important thing is that we recognise the spirit of Christmas and look after each other. My show is about mental health. It's about suffering from mental health issues, about what to do, how to deal with it, ideas about it, and just bringing things into the light. That is the most important thing, because for so long now, so much has been kept hidden, been kept quiet and ignored. I think that human beings are very prone to doing nothing and hoping things go away, bad things, Oh, well, if I do nothing, maybe it'll be all right, maybe it'll go away. And of course, what that does is that allows really bad problems to fester away and poison society. And this is exactly what has happened. When I was growing up, a lot of people ended up very mentally damaged because of the violence and abuse that they went through, and people basically just turned their backs, turned a blind eye to things that were going on. You might have heard of the Yeppooney Boys Home. That was just down the road from me, and that was a terrible place where a lot of young men got very, very badly damaged and suffered for the rest of their lives. Thankfully, institutions like that are beginning to disappear, or at least are coming out into the light, and people are talking about things a lot more, which is great. But unfortunately, the most important things are being ignored. For example, one of the terrible statistics we have in New Zealand is violence, and of course, that leads to a lot of mental health issues, that kind of violation and abuse, and it generally tends to happen to the most vulnerable, like women, often the targets of brutality and the frustrations of violent partners who have not been educated, who have not been taught how to deal with their anger and frustration, and all they know is how to lash out. That's all they've ever been taught. That's all they ever know. And so they perpetrate the violence that was perpetrated upon them. They continue this chain of violence. And when you break that chain of violence, that's it. It's over forever. Once you get that person to face what they're doing, to really think about not just what they're doing, but how it's affecting other people. Once they come to truly empathise with that and put themselves in that person's place, that person that they've been abusing, once they realise what they're doing to that person, they can often turn around. But until that point of confrontation and self-reflection, the violence continues on and on forever. But it can be broken. Violence begets violence, but it can be broken. There can be a point where we say no more. Now, obviously, women need protection. People need to keep their eyes and their ears open. They need to speak out when they see friends or acquaintances or relatives being abused by anybody. But probably the worst statistic of all is that half of all of the violence perpetrated is specifically targeted at one tiny group of people in our society, and that is young Maori men and women, teenagers and slightly younger. Those young people, who represent about 4% of our entire population, are subjected to 50% of the violence in society. So those young people are the most vulnerable, and we know that, and we're not looking out for them. We are letting them down, and they need to be watched. They actually need to have heroes and heroines looking after them, talking to them, checking with them. And once you get over this myth about how it shouldn't be spoken about and has to be hidden, and victims feel this guilt and so they stay quiet and the abuse continues. Well, if this is brought out into the light, that is what will make the violence stop. And we owe it to these young people, these wonderful young men and women who will one day be parents themselves. We need to ensure that they are being brought up the right way, free of abuse, free of violence, because of two things. One, it will allow them to become better role models and not perpetrate this violence and continue it. And two, there will be less, not so much physical damage, that heals pretty quick, but it's the mental damage that people carry on after years of abuse. This is something that follows them like a shadow for the rest of their living days. So if we can get onto it early, the other thing we need to do is we need to incorporate the Dunedin study into all early childhood education. Every single early childhood person ought to be studying this report. It ought to be part of their training and part of their everyday work, so they know exactly what the signs are when they see a young person acting out and they could tell something's wrong. Get onto it then before the damage is done, because really the damage for young people who suffer from mental illnesses is often done very, very early in their lives. Around about 3 or 4 years old, you can already see this person is not going to get on so well with their peers. There is a problem and we need to address it. And if you can get onto it then, that young person, by the time they're 8, 9 years old, can be living a perfectly good, stable, happy life. So it can be turned around very early. And honestly, isn't prevention far better than picking up being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, picking up the mess after it's happened? Prevention saves money, it saves time, but most importantly, it saves people. Right, that's my little spiel for today, and I hope everyone takes it on board and realises that you can do your part just by speaking out. That is all you need to do. You don't have to go and confront some violent person. You simply need to talk about it and make the right people aware so that the good decisions can be made, and people who deserve to be protected can be protected by the people that are in the position where they can do that. What you can do, what your part is to bring it into the light, to talk about it, and never stop talking about it. Keep on at it all the time until you see smiling faces around. And remember, kindness costs you nothing. This is something I try to hammer through every week, is doing something decent. You don't have to go out of your way a hell of a lot to make somebody's life just so much better and put a smile into their day. It costs so little to help. Right, on to a happier subject. Now, I've led a very interesting life over the years. I decided to sacrifice financial reward for adventure when I was a young man. I just absolutely could not stand the society that I was growing up in. I rebelled against it and hated it in every way, so I decided that we would head off on an adventure, and I never intended coming back. I honestly believed that I would live in London for the rest of my living days, but it wasn't to be. And I spent a couple of years out in Africa and 5 years in London, travelling Europe, and a bit of time in Southeast Asia, 6 months on the way home. So, I've seen a fair bit of the world, and I didn't just go around in Contiki buses taking photos out of the window. I actually lived with the people of each country, hitchhiking, so that I threw myself upon the kindness of strangers and relied on foreigners who I didn't know anything about. And as it turned out, I had a wonderful, wonderful time, and I met so many incredible people, thousands of amazing people all over the world. And, I was very privileged to live through some amazing times, Margaret Thatcher's presidency, as it was, the Falklands War, Desert Storm, the Berlin Wall coming down, the end of communism, Nelson Mandela being freed from Robben Island. So many things went on while I was overseas, and it was wonderful to be part of it because we are very much isolated down here and we're told very little of what's actually going on around the world. You'd be amazed what's actually happening in comparison to what we know about. Unfortunately, our media doesn't do a terribly good job of keeping us informed, but it's amazing to be right in the hub, right in the middle of things in Europe and seeing so much going around. But this particular story today was from my couple of years out in Africa, and this one today is called the Kalahari and the Chobe River. 4 of us struck out north from Pretoria, South Africa. We headed for the thirsty land of the Kalahari. Ceedy, Wayne, Dave and myself had bought a car in Johannesburg and were driving up to the Chobe River on the far side of the Kalahari Desert. We planned to drive the length of the Kalahari to one of the great river systems of the north. Our aim was the Chobe National Game Park in Botswana. Our first day's drive from Pretoria was a mixture of exhilaration and trepidation. At first there was the reassurance of farms and horticulture made possible with irrigation. South Africa, for all of its shortcomings, still had well-organised systems in place which made life possible in tremendous heat. When the Dutch first crossed this place, they named them the Thirsty Lands. Driving over the border from South Africa to southern Botswana was like day to night. Suddenly the desert proper began looking reminiscent of the Australian outback. A large straight motorway led us into sandy, rather barren land that had not seen rain or water in a very long time. Occasionally the motorway opened out and doubled up as a landing strip for planes. There was very little game around as a result of little foliage. The little we saw in our travels looked half-starved. We planned to spend as little time as possible in the southern parched lands and head for the promise the northern rivers provided. There are 3 great river systems in the north. The Okavango, which starts life in the Angolan heights and floods erratically through northern Botswana. Secondly, the Kuando River starts in Namibia and again erratically floods marshlands until it becomes the Chobe River system in Botswana. The Chobe then meets the mighty Zambezi, which flows down from Zambia, and they become the amazing Victoria Falls on the Zambia-Zimbabwe border. We were heading to the Middle River system, where it turns into the Chobe River in a well-established national park. It boasts some of the greatest concentrations of game anywhere in Africa. The water and grasslands attract hundreds of thousands of wildebeest and zebra, along with gazelles, kudu and impala, and giraffe and so on. They in turn attract lions, leopards, cheetahs and hyena. The most impressive of all, however, are the tens of thousands of elephants this good grazing attracts. But before we reached the grassy north, we had to battle through the parched south. We pulled into a small town in the middle of nowhere after trying a shortcut which resulted in some damage to the car. While refuelling and getting repairs done, we stopped for a Coke and were mobbed by about 100 local kids. We were told most of them had never seen a white man, and they delighted in pinching the hair on our arms to make sure we were real. The children were full of life and very clean considering a lack of water. But we pushed on hard north, driving from dawn till dark, and managed to spend only a few nights in the desert, camping where and when we had to. After stopping in another nowhere town, Ceedy decided to rattle off a few photographs. Unfortunately, he accidentally photographed mud huts surrounded by razor wire with a sign saying military installation on it. Before long, a jeep turned up on the scene, and at first the boys in the back holding AK-47s were all smiles for the camera. Suddenly, however, the sergeant took exception to what we were doing and angrily demanded to see our film. Smiles turned to frowns, and suddenly we were facing 4 loaded AK-47s. At first, CD tried to argue with the sergeant, but as things escalated, changed his mind and handed over the camera. The ignorant sergeant then exposed the film to the sunlight, then rolled it up and took our details, promising to return it once checked. This at least diffused the scary situation, and the privates shouldered their weapons. Life is cheap in Africa, and I truly feared for our lives for a few minutes. We couldn't get out of that town fast enough, and it was good to get back on the road north. After a few more days of motoring through the desert, we finally started to see some green trees, an increased amount of scrub and life. Then one day, I came round the corner, and all of a sudden 3 elephants were wandering across the motorway, blocking our way. For a few seconds I was too stunned to do anything, as these massive animals ambled along. This was our first introduction to the Chobe area, and it stunned us all to see these great creatures wandering free in the open. Before long we reached the game park proper and were surprised to see how little infrastructure there was to the place. There were a few safari-style places set up, but other than that, no real camps as such. We simply paid to enter and were free to set up camp anywhere we could. Upon entering the game park, we were blown away by the incredible amounts of life everywhere. Hundreds of species of birds, zebra and wildebeest in their countless thousands. Antelope like gazelle, the huge impala and the impressive kudu with its corkscrew horns, all of them in massive numbers. Many other game like giraffes and hippos were also common along the river. But the most impressive of all was the vast amounts of elephants wandering freely. All of these animals in turn attracted huge numbers of predators like lions, cheetahs, leopards and hyenas. Our first day in the Chobe National Game Park, we met up with some hunters who told us they were culling elephants. The numbers were too great to sustain and they were devastating the bush habitat. They were culling whole family units at a time, so as to cause as little disruption as possible. We found it hard to believe that such wholesale slaughter was necessary, though the explanation was compelling. On the river itself, we saw elephants to the red horizon. Nothing could have prepared us for that magnificent sight. As the sun slowly lowered red to the horizon, the elephants came down to bathe. Even the grumpy hippo were forced to give up the best parts of the river. The elephants truly revelled joyously in this time. They play with their young, free in their great numbers from any predator. Instead, the lions lie hidden in the long grasses, waiting patiently for an opportunity of easier prey. Life on the river runs like clockwork, and each animal that needs water has its turn. On our first day on the Chobe River, we caught the last half of the day. We found a flat patch of grass at around lunchtime. We were immediately robbed of biscuits by the monkeys when we stopped for a feed. Dozens of baboons descended on the scene after the monkeys, and we quickly learned to leave nothing out for the robbers to have. The male baboons were particularly large and intimidating, with huge fangs and showing little fear of man. The best way to spot game was from the relative safety of the car. So after setting up our tents, we set off on the unsealed, sandy, bumpy roads. I was the designated driver by now, and the roads were sorely testing. I quickly learned the most dangerous time was driving through a family group of elephants. The young ones, ranging from 1 to 2 tonne, would suddenly charge headfirst towards us. These mock charges were truly frightening, and the only way to stop them is to plant boot and charge straight at them. The dust and the roar of the engine puts them off, but I had to be careful not to hit them, as 4-tonne Mum was always looking on. The large bull elephants, however, must be avoided at all costs. They are short-tempered, huge, and run surprisingly quickly. We watched them bulldoze whole trees down and strip them of all the leaves. The amount of devastation they caused was unbelievable. After spending the afternoon game spotting, we returned to camp to cook tea. As we cooked up what we had on the riverside camp, a family of warthogs came trotting past us and into their burrows in the riverbed. The water flowed quickly at this point, so there were no crocodiles about. At the same time, I felt very vulnerable in our makeshift camp. I didn't sleep at all well, and at about 2 a.m. something came sniffing at my head. With only a millimetre of plastic between us, I was frozen with fear. The creature then moved off, and I fell into a whiskey-induced sleep. I woke at the dawn chorus of birds and general wildlife. I poked my head out of the tent to watch our warthog neighbours trot past on their way out. The 4 of us headed out after breakfast. We spent all day driving around game spotting, and before long Dave spotted a lioness in the long grass. I stopped and hopped out for a better look, but could not see her. I walked forward, but again I did not see her until she blinked. By then it became suddenly obvious that she could run me down, so I slowly backed up without unlocking eye contact. It was the first and last time I made that mistake in Africa. We had a great day game spotting with loads of beautiful antelope to watch, along with any big cats that might be following. The middle of the day was too hot, however, for the cats, and the game was left to graze in freedom. Generally speaking, only the young and very olds are the most vulnerable, as they are culled from the herd most often. We then headed back to camp for tea and sunset. A huge number of elephants came down to the river to drink each sunset and bathe, and turned on a great show for us. Our campsite was perfectly elevated for viewing up the river with binoculars. The sight of at least 100 animals in the lenses is something no zoo or wildlife centre could prepare us for. Slowly, as I got more used to being surrounded by wildlife, the adventure became more enjoyable. We clicked into a routine of getting up at dawn and driving around game spotting each day. We soon learned the best spots near our camp, and no 2 days were ever quite the same. On one hot afternoon, we were watching a huge elephant bulldoze down trees. He had a particularly huge set of tusks and made for some great photographs. Suddenly, Wayne decided he needed a good close-up and jumped out of the car and approached the huge beast. The elephant suddenly turned his attentions from the tree he was eating to Wayne. The bull stamped his foot and flared his great ears in warning, but Wayne remained oblivious, happily snapping off some great shots. The bull then trumpeted, stamped its huge foot, and it was all too late for Wayne as he began to charge. "I'm out of here," I shouted to Wayne, and turned away, planting boot as I went. Wayne made a sudden sprint for the car and managed to dive head first through the open passenger side window as I spun the wheel. As I roared off, my foot flat to the floor, All I could see was a huge elephant's head in the rear vision mirror. I could feel the ground shaking as he charged after us. Luckily, I had just enough power to outsprint the bull and slowly pull away from him, with Wayne hanging halfway out of the open window, far too close for comfort. After that incident, we made sure not to push our luck too much, as these animals were truly wild and had little fear of man. At one point, the road was blocked by a troop of baboons, with one particularly belligerent male that parked himself in the middle of the road. I got out to shoo him away, only to come darting back in as he screamed and charged at me. We soon learned not to underestimate any of the wildlife about. Living conditions were the most basic in our makeshift camp. The water was unusable because of bilharzia, a nasty waterborne parasite that destroys the liver and has no cure. We were also limited by our food stores, which we rationed carefully. Luckily enough, there were no more incidents at camp, so we were able to adapt to the routine of the river. Each morning our warthog neighbours would parade past us at dawn as we made breakfast. We spent each day trying to spot new species as well as our favourites. The giraffe were always fun to watch, as they looked so awkward as they stooped knock-kneed to drink. Although ungainly to look at, they made for great watching as they grazed high up in the trees. Pretty much every species had some impressive attribute, from the grace of the antelope to the stealth of their predators, to the massive horned water buffalo, the ugly-looking wildebeest, the beautiful zebra, and all the other grazers. The most impressive of all, however, were the massive elephants with their huge tusks and trunks. To my mind at least, they were the kings of the jungle. Despite the hardships we had to endure, our time at Chobe was over all too soon. But I feel we left a little piece of ourselves there and took a little of that place with us. I look back on those days wistfully now, and I'm sure the three guys I travelled with feel the same. The end. Well, that's me for another week. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll be back again next week. Special thanks to our sponsors, to Michael and Veronica for doing such a wonderful job here at Arrow, to Wairarapa TV. Thank you all from the Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.